The cold wind howled through the narrow alley as Daniel pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. His breath came out in short, misty bursts, but he barely noticed. Tonight, everything felt heavier, the weight of failure, of lost chances, of voices in his head telling him he wasn't good enough. He had always been the kind of person who second-guessed himself, who let fear dictate his choices. And now, standing at the edge of another disappointment, he wondered if he was simply not meant for more. Just a few hours ago, Daniel had stood outside the doors of a prestigious company, clutching his resume with trembling hands. This was his last chance. He had spent months preparing for this interview, practicing his answers, perfecting every detail. But the moment he stepped into that cold, intimidating conference room, doubt had crept in like an unwelcome guest. The panel of interviewers seemed unimpressed, their expressions unreadable. He felt small, insignificant. His own mind whispered that he wasn't smart enough, not qualified enough, not good enough. And just like that, he had stumbled through his answers, his voice uncertain, his confidence crumbling. When the interview ended, he already knew the outcome. The polite smiles, the forced handshakes, they told him everything. He walked out feeling defeated, like a man who had once dared to dream but had been reminded of his place. Now, as he sat on a lonely bench in the city park, the weight of self-doubt pressed hard against his chest. Was this it? Was this all he was meant to be? Someone who tried but never succeeded? He pulled out his phone and mindlessly scrolled through social media, seeing post after post of people celebrating their successes, their perfect lives. A bitter smile tugged at his lips. How did they make it look so easy? Why did self-belief come so naturally to them while he had to fight for every ounce of confidence? As he stared at the city lights reflecting on the river, an old memory surfaced, his grandfather's voice, warm and steady, telling him as a child, "The strongest battles are fought in the mind, Danny. You either let the world decide who you are, or you decide for yourself." He hadn't thought about those words in years, but now they echoed in his heart, stirring something deep within him. Maybe the problem wasn't that he wasn't good enough. Maybe the problem was that he had never truly believed he was. Just then, an elderly man sat down beside him on the bench. His face was weathered, his eyes kind but sharp, as if he had seen the weight of the world and carried it with quiet strength. He glanced at Daniel and said, almost as if reading his thoughts, "You look like a man who's lost a battle with himself." Daniel let out a humorless chuckle. "Something like that." The man nodded thoughtfully. "You know, most people think the greatest obstacle in life is the world around them. The truth is, it's the voice in their head." He tapped his temple lightly. "That voice can be your greatest enemy or your most powerful ally." Daniel frowned, considering the words. "And what if it's always been an enemy? Then it's time you change the conversation." The man leaned back, looking up at the stars. "Because until you do, the world will keep proving you right." Daniel sat in silence, his mind turning over the words. Was it really that simple? Could self-belief truly change everything? He had spent his whole life waiting for the world to tell him he was worthy, but what if he needed to believe it first? The thought lingered, igniting something inside him, a spark, small but fierce. He didn't know it yet, but this moment, this simple conversation on a cold night, would mark the beginning of a journey that would change his life forever. Daniel sat on the cold bench long after the old man left, the stranger's words echoing in his mind like a melody he couldn't shake. Change the conversation. It sounded simple, almost too simple. How could shifting his internal dialogue rewrite the story of his life? 4 years, his mind had been a battlefield, and self-doubt had always emerged victorious. He had learned to live with it, like an unwelcome companion whispering negativity at every turn. But tonight, something felt different. The spark the man had ignited refused to fade. As the city lights flickered in the distance, Daniel found himself thinking about the times when he'd felt that same spark before. Those rare moments when self-belief had broken through the walls of uncertainty. He remembered his high school art competition, the one he almost didn't enter. He'd spent weeks working on a portrait of his mother, pouring every ounce of his heart into the piece. But the night before submission, he had convinced himself it wasn't good enough. He nearly threw it away, but his mother stopped him. She held his hands and said softly, "Daniel, if you don't believe in your own work, how can anyone else?" Her words gave him the courage to submit it, and to his surprise, he won first place. For a brief time after that, he had believed in himself. But as the years went on, that belief had eroded under the weight of failures and rejections. Now, the idea of reclaiming that sense of inner strength felt both exciting and impossible. He stood up from the bench, his heart heavy but his mind restless. He walked through the quiet streets, his footsteps echoing against the pavement. The city, though familiar, seemed different tonight, as if it, too, was waiting for something to change. When he reached his small apartment, Daniel collapsed onto the worn-out couch and stared at the ceiling. The silence was suffocating, amplifying the endless stream of doubts. But beneath the noise, a single thought stood firm: change the conversation. He decided to try. He sat up, took a deep breath, and whispered into the empty room, "I am capable." The words felt foreign on his tongue, like a language he'd never spoken before. He repeated them again and again, until they didn't sound like a lie. The next morning, Daniel woke with the faint memory of his own voice lingering in his mind. He dragged himself to the kitchen and made a cup of coffee, his thoughts racing. Today, he promised himself, he would push past the doubt, even if it was just in small ways. He opened his laptop and began searching for new job opportunities. Every time the fear crept in, whispering that he wasn't qualified, he countered it with the words he had practiced the night before: "I am capable." It wasn't easy. The doubt didn't disappear, but it didn't paralyze him either. Later that afternoon, Daniel decided to clear his head with a walk. The city streets were alive with people, each person seemingly lost in their own world. As he passed a bookstore, something caught his eye. In the window display was a single book with bold, black letters: "The Power of Belief, Unlocking Your True Potential." Without thinking, he walked inside and bought it. That night, Daniel sat on his couch and opened the book. The first chapter told the story of a woman who had grown up in a small town, plagued by self-doubt. She had failed countless times but eventually achieved her dreams through relentless belief in herself. The story resonated with Daniel, reminding him of the old man's words and his mother's encouragement all those years ago. Days passed, and Daniel made it a habit to challenge his negative thoughts. It was like learning to walk again, awkward and unsteady, but with each step, the weight of doubt grew a little lighter. He applied for more jobs, practiced interview answers with conviction, and even picked up his sketchbook after years of neglect. Drawing had always given him a sense of peace, a reminder that creation required courage. One evening, Daniel received an unexpected call from a company he barely remembered applying to. The woman on the line invited him for an interview the following week. His heart raced. The excitement was quickly overshadowed by a familiar fear. What if he froze again? What if he messed it all up, just like before? But then, he heard the old man's voice in his mind. Change the conversation. The days leading up to the interview were a tug-of-war between belief and doubt. Daniel practiced his answers, reminded himself of his strengths, and visualized walking into that room with confidence. The night before the interview, he stood in front of the mirror and said, "I am capable," until he almost believed it. The next morning, Daniel dressed in his best suit and headed to the office building. As he stood in the lobby, anxiety clawed at his chest. He glanced around and saw other candidates, all of them seeming more confident, more experienced. He was about to turn around and leave when he felt a gentle tap on his shoulder. He turned to see the old man from the park standing there, the same kind eyes and knowing smile. Daniel blinked in surprise. "You," he said, his voice shaky. The man chuckled softly. "Funny how life works, isn't it? I told you the hardest battle is in the mind. Looks like you're here to fight it today." Daniel swallowed hard, his heart pounding. "I don't know if I can do this." The old man placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. The question isn't if you can. The question is whether you believe you can. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but the receptionist called his name. His legs felt like lead as he walked toward the interview room. His mind screamed that he wasn't ready, but the old man's words anchored him. Believe you can. He stepped through the door, the panel of interviewers sitting behind a long, polished table. His palms were sweaty, his throat dry. But instead of focusing on the fear, he focused on the belief that, maybe, just maybe, he was more capable than he thought. The lead interviewer smiled. "Good morning, Daniel. Let's begin." Daniel took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and met their eyes. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady for the first time in a long time. Outside, the city moved on as usual. People rushed to work, cars honked, and life unfolded in its familiar rhythm. But for Daniel, everything had shifted. He was standing at the edge of the unknown, facing the fear head-on. And this time, for the first time in years, he chose to believe in himself. But as the interview progressed, one question lingered in the back of his mind. Who exactly was that old man, and how did he appear exactly when Daniel needed him most? The air inside the interview room felt thick, like it carried the weight of Daniel's self-doubt alongside the stale scent of coffee and printer paper. The panel of interviewers sat across from him, their faces neutral, eyes scanning his resume. His pulse quickened with each passing second. He gripped the edge of his chair, forcing himself to remember the words that had carried him this far. I am capable. But beneath that fragile belief, another thought kept gnawing at him. Who was that old man? And why did his presence feel so intentional? The woman in the middle cleared her throat. So, Daniel, tell us about a time when you faced a challenge and how you handled it. His mind raced, flipping through memories like pages in a book. The old him would have stumbled here, hesitated, second-guessed every word. But this time, Daniel drew a deep breath and spoke. He told them about the art competition, about almost throwing the portrait away. I realized, he said, his voice steadier than he expected, that the hardest battles aren't against the world. They're against the voice inside us telling us we're not enough. As he spoke, he noticed the panel's expressions shift. Slight nods, softened gazes. They were listening. Really listening. The conversation flowed more easily after that, but the unease never fully left him. The old man's sudden appearance lingered in his thoughts like a shadow that refused to fade. When the interview ended, Daniel stepped outside and inhaled the crisp, cool air. Relief mixed with confusion. He looked around for the old man, half expecting to find him watching from a distance. But the sidewalk was crowded with strangers, none of them familiar. The days that followed dragged on, each one heavier with anticipation. Daniel tried to stay busy, sketching, applying to more jobs, but his mind kept circling back to the man from the park. He remembered the man's eyes, the way his words had landed so deeply. And then there was the timing, too perfect to be coincidence. One evening, Daniel found himself back at the park, sitting on the same bench where they had first spoken. The night was cold, just like before, and the city lights shimmered on the water. He waited, though he wasn't sure for what. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. Just the distant hum of traffic and the occasional jogger passing by. Frustrated, Daniel stood to leave. But as he turned, he caught a glimpse of movement near the lamppost. A figure stepped into the dim light. It was the old man. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He felt a mixture of relief and dread. He walked toward the man, his steps cautious. "You're here," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. The man smiled softly. "I figured you might come back." Daniel's chest tightened. Who are you? And how did you know I needed help that night?" The old man's eyes twinkled with something Daniel couldn't place. Kindness, maybe, or something deeper. "I've been where you are," the man said. "I know what it's like to fight that voice every day." He gestured to the bench, and Daniel sat beside him. For a moment, Neither of them spoke. The wind rustled through the bare trees, whispering secrets Daniel couldn't quite hear. Finally, he broke the silence. "It feels like you showed up at the exact moment I needed you." Twice. The man's gaze drifted toward the water. "Belief is powerful, Daniel. When you start changing the conversation in your mind, the world around you shifts too." Daniel frowned. "What does that mean?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he stood and turned to leave. Panic surged through Daniel. "Wait," he called, standing quickly. "You can't just show up like this and leave without explaining." The man paused and looked over his shoulder. "The answers you're looking for aren't out here," he said, tapping his temple. "They're in here. Trust yourself, Daniel. That's the real challenge." And then he was gone, disappearing into the shadows as if the night itself swallowed him whole. Daniel stood there, heart racing. He had expected answers, clarity. Instead, he was left with more questions. He walked home, his mind spinning with confusion. Who was this man who appeared when Daniel was at his lowest? And how did he seem to know so much about Daniel's internal struggle? That night, Daniel sat at his desk, flipping through his sketchbook. Without thinking, his pencil moved across the paper. He drew the old man's face, those deep-set eyes, the creases around his mouth, the slight tilt of his head. When he finished, he stared at the portrait. The face was familiar, but not just because he'd met the man twice. There was something else, something his brain couldn't quite grasp. Unable to shake the feeling, Daniel opened his laptop and searched for articles about belief, self-doubt, and the power of the mind. The more he read, the more the man's words made sense. Psychologists often wrote about the inner critic and the importance of positive self-talk. But this felt deeper. It wasn't just about affirmations. It was about rewriting the core of his identity. Days passed without further sightings of the old man, but Daniel couldn't let it go. One afternoon, he took the sketch to his mother's house, hoping she might offer some insight. His mother greeted him with a warm hug and ushered him into the living room. Daniel handed her the drawing. "Does this face look familiar to you?" Her smile faded as she studied the paper. Her brow furrowed, and she sat down heavily on the couch. "Mom?" Daniel's heart raced. "What is it?" She ran a finger along the sketch's lines. This looks like your grandfather." "My father." Her voice trembled. "But Daniel, he died before you were born." Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. "That's not possible," he whispered. His mother shook her head, eyes wide with disbelief. "He used to say those words to me all the time, about how the greatest battles are in the mind, and how we have to change the conversation." Daniel's knees weakened, and he sat beside her. The room seemed to shift, the walls closing in around him. The man in the park wasn't just some random stranger. He was someone connected to Daniel in ways he couldn't yet understand. The questions multiplied, their weight suffocating. If it really was his grandfather, or some version of him, why was he appearing now? And what did he want Daniel to learn? The phone rang suddenly, breaking the silence. Daniel's mother answered it and then handed the phone to him. "It's the company you interviewed with," she said. Daniel took the phone with shaking hands. "Hello." "Hi, Daniel. We're calling to let you know that you got the job." "Congratulations." The words barely registered. He mumbled a thank you, ended the call, and stared at the sketch of his grandfather. The job he had desperately wanted was his, but it didn't feel like the biggest revelation of the day. Somewhere beyond the physical world he understood, something larger was at play. And Daniel realized that the greatest battle of his life had just begun. The room felt colder than it should have. Daniel sat on the couch beside his mother, the sketch of his grandfather resting on the coffee table between them. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. The idea that the man he'd met in the park, the one who had guided him through his darkest moments, might be his grandfather, a man who had died decades ago, was impossible to grasp. Logic tried to dismiss it as a coincidence, but the resemblance was undeniable. His mother's pale face confirmed what Daniel couldn't explain away. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice barely more than a whisper, "how can this be possible?" She shook her head, running a hand through her hair. I don't know, Daniel. Your grandfather was always fascinated by the power of the mind. He believed that belief itself could shape reality. He used to say, when you change the way you think, the world changes with you. But seeing him, or someone who looks exactly like him, it doesn't make sense. Daniel rubbed his temples, trying to ground himself. He said something similar to me, about how the voice in your mind can be your enemy or your ally. His mother exhaled slowly. That sounds exactly like him. After he passed, I kept hearing his voice when I doubted myself. I always thought it was just a memory. Daniel's gaze returned to the sketch. The eyes stared back, calm and knowing. He couldn't shake the feeling that his grandfather was trying to tell him something important. But what? And why now? The job offer, the sudden appearance of his grandfather's likeness, the advice that had pushed him to face his fears, it all felt connected. Daniel's mind raced with possibilities. Maybe belief wasn't just about changing your internal dialogue. Maybe, on some level, belief could reach beyond what was logical or visible. The days that followed were a blur. Daniel started his new job, throwing himself into the unfamiliar world of marketing analytics. The work was challenging, but each time doubt surfaced, he whispered to himself, "I am capable." The voice of self-belief grew stronger with each passing day. But the mystery of his grandfather lingered, like a shadow following him through every moment of success. One evening, Daniel sat at his desk, unable to focus. He opened the sketchbook again, tracing the lines of his grandfather's face. On impulse, he opened his laptop and searched his grandfather's name, Thomas Bennett. Countless unrelated results appeared, news articles, obituaries of strangers with the same name, but nothing helpful. He was about to give up when a small, obscure link caught his eye. The Mind's Influence, a legacy of Thomas Bennett. His pulse quickened as he clicked the link. It led to an old grainy scan of a newspaper article. The headline read, "Thomas Bennett, the man who believed the mind could shape reality." Daniel leaned in, reading every word. His grandfather had been a self-taught researcher, fascinated by the human mind's potential. The article mentioned how Thomas believed that strong, unwavering belief could sometimes create ripples beyond ordinary understanding. He had given lectures on how fear and doubt could block opportunities while belief could open invisible doors. At the bottom of the article was a single quote, "The strongest battles are fought within the mind. When you truly believe in yourself, the universe takes notice." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The exact words his grandfather had said to him in the park. His hand trembled as he closed the laptop. If belief was as powerful as his grandfather claimed, then perhaps his own transformation wasn't just about internal confidence. Maybe his belief had somehow drawn his grandfather's presence into his life. But why now? Why after all these years? The question haunted him. Days passed, each one heavier with unanswered mysteries. His work performance improved, his confidence grew, and yet the uncertainty gnawed at the edges of his mind. One night, unable to sleep, Daniel returned to the park. The bench where he'd first met his grandfather sat empty under the glow of the street lamp. He stood there, unsure of what to expect, then whispered into the night, "I know you're here. I need answers." The silence stretched, broken only by the rustling leaves. Daniel was about to give up when a familiar voice came from behind him. "You've already found the answers, Daniel. You just don't trust them yet." He turned around. His grandfather stood there, hands in his coat pockets, eyes as kind and steady as ever. Daniel's throat tightened. "Why me? Why now?" His grandfather's expression softened. "Because you finally started believing in yourself. And because you're standing at the edge of something bigger than you realize. Daniel's chest constricted. What do you mean? His grandfather stepped closer. Belief isn't just about success, Daniel. It's about potential. Most people live their entire lives never understanding the power they carry within their minds. But you've unlocked a door. And now you have a choice.
A choice?
Daniel's voice cracked with uncertainty. Yes. His grandfather's eyes seemed to pierce through him. You can go back to a life where doubt rules your decisions, where fear keeps you safe but small. Or you can step into a life where belief shapes your reality. A life where your thoughts don't just change your mind, but the world around you. Daniel's pulse raced. It sounded unbelievable, yet everything about this moment confirmed the truth of his grandfather's words. His own transformation, from fear to self-assurance, had already proven how powerful belief could be. But how do I know what's real? Daniel asked. His grandfather gave a faint smile. Reality is shaped by what you believe is possible. The mind is more powerful than you've ever imagined. But power comes with responsibility. If you choose to embrace this, you'll face challenges greater than self-doubt. The world resists change. It resists belief. And there are forces that thrive on fear and disbelief. Daniel's heart pounded. What kind of forces? His grandfather's eyes darkened slightly. Doubt isn't just a feeling, Daniel. It can take form. And when belief grows stronger, doubt fights harder. The air around them seemed to shift, growing colder. Daniel's skin prickled with unease. The park, once familiar and calm, felt different now, as if unseen eyes were watching from the shadows. What do I do? Daniel whispered. His grandfather placed a hand on his shoulder. Stay grounded in your belief. Trust your mind's power. And remember, fear will try to break you. But fear only wins if you believe it can. The wind picked up, swirling around them. The street lamp above flickered. Daniel blinked, and in that split second, his grandfather was gone. Daniel stood there, breathless, the weight of his grandfather's words pressing down on him. He didn't fully understand what he was facing, but he felt it, an unseen force, like a cold whisper brushing against his mind. The battle for self-belief wasn't just internal anymore. Something darker was watching, waiting to pull him back into doubt. And Daniel realized, with growing dread, that the true fight had only just begun. Daniel stood in the park long after his grandfather had vanished. The wind continued to whip around him, but it no longer felt refreshing. Instead, it was oppressive, like the world itself was holding its breath. The faint hum of the city beyond the trees seemed distant, as if the ordinary sounds of life had receded into an eerie silence. His mind raced. Fear, doubt, and disbelief had all but paralyzed him. What had just happened? Had it been real? He had asked for answers, and yet, all he had received were more questions. The part of him that wanted to run, to escape into the comfort of what he knew, screamed for him to leave, but something deeper inside held him there. He wasn't done yet. He had to understand. Just as he turned to leave, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his mother, simple but alarming. "We need to talk. It's about Grandpa." His pulse quickened as he dialed her number, but before she could answer, a new message popped up on his screen. "We found something." It's not just about belief. Daniel's mind raced, panic bubbling up. What does that mean? He tried calling again, but there was no answer. Something inside him told him that the time for waiting had passed. He needed to know what was going on now. Without a second thought, he started running toward his mother's house, each step faster than the last. When he arrived, his mother was sitting at the kitchen table, a pile of old letters and papers spread before her. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled as she sifted through the yellowing pages. When she looked up, her eyes were wide with fear. "Mom, what's going on?" Daniel asked, his voice tight. She gestured to the papers. "I found something, Daniel. Something I wasn't supposed to. His mother handed him a letter, its edges worn and frayed, as though it had been handled countless times. The handwriting was familiar, his grandfather's, unmistakable. "Read it," she urged, her voice trembling. "It's from when he was, well, before he died. I never thought I'd see this." Daniel's heart hammered as he unfolded the letter. It began with a simple message, but the deeper he read, the more the words sent a chill down his spine. The letter detailed a project, a secret his grandfather had worked on for years. It was about the mind, about belief, and about a hidden power that could manipulate reality itself. His grandfather had written about the threshold, a concept he believed could be crossed when someone reached the pinnacle of self-belief. It wasn't just about mental strength, it was about tapping into a force that connected everything. The mind, the body, and something far beyond. Thomas Bennett had claimed he was close to understanding it, that his final breakthrough was within his grasp. But the letter ended with a chilling warning: be careful. If you cross the threshold, you may not be able to return. The consequences could be more than you can bear. Daniel's hands shook as he placed the letter down. This can't be real, Mom. This is crazy. His mother sat back in her chair, her face pale. That's not all. I found another letter, one addressed to you. His stomach dropped. To me? Yes. It's from your grandfather, dated just days before he passed away. Daniel reached for the second letter, his fingers trembling. He unfolded it with more caution this time, and his eyes skimmed the words. It was a cryptic message, almost as though his grandfather had known that Daniel would need it someday. In it, Thomas Bennett wrote, "I have been preparing you for this moment, Daniel. You may not understand it yet, but you will. The threshold is not just a place, it's a state of mind. And soon, you will find yourself at its edge. When that time comes, you must remember, self-belief is your only key to unlocking the truth. Do not let fear cloud your path. And beware, for there are those who would try to stop you." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. His grandfather had known. He had known that Daniel would be drawn into something bigger than himself. The warning echoed in his ears. There are those who would try to stop you. His mind raced. Who were those people? And what did they want? Before he could speak, the doorbell rang, shattering the tense silence in the room. His mother went pale. "Who could that be?" she whispered. Daniel's chest tightened as he moved to the door. He opened it slowly, eyes scanning the street outside. There was no one there. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a figure standing at the far end of the street, partially obscured by the shadows. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. "Mom, lock the door," Daniel said, his voice sharp. He stepped back inside, heart pounding in his chest. Whoever that person was, they were watching him, waiting. His mother, confused, glanced out the window but saw nothing. "Daniel, there's no one out there." But Daniel wasn't sure. He knew something had changed. Something was closing in on him, and the danger he had once believed was only in his mind was now very real. He turned to his mother. "We need to go. Now." "Where?" She was already reaching for her coat, but her voice was laced with confusion. "I don't know," Daniel admitted, feeling a surge of panic. "But we can't stay here." As they rushed out the door, Daniel could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The warning in the letter, the strange figure outside, his grandfather's cryptic message. All of it was adding up to something much larger than he could have ever imagined. As they made their way to the car, Daniel glanced over his shoulder. The figure was still there, watching, unmoving, as though it had been waiting for them all along. Who were these people? What did they want from him? The world he had once known, the one built on logic, on certainty, was slipping away, replaced by something darker, more mysterious. Something that not only threatened his future but the very fabric of reality itself. And in that moment, as they drove away, Daniel understood that he was no longer just fighting for his own belief. He was fighting for something much bigger, something that could change the world. The questions lingered in the air, unanswered, but one thing was certain: the threshold was closer than ever. And soon, Daniel would have to decide if he had the strength to cross it, or if he would be consumed by the forces waiting to pull him back into the darkness. The car sped down the dark road, its headlights slicing through the night like a knife through fog. Daniel's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. His mother sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window, her face drawn and anxious. Neither of them said a word. They were both too lost in their own thoughts, haunted by the same question: what was coming for them? As they neared the outskirts of town, Daniel's eyes darted to the rear-view mirror. He saw nothing at first, but then the figure from earlier reappeared, moving fast, shadowed by the trees that lined the road. The figure wasn't just walking, it was running, and it was closing the distance between them. Daniel's breath caught. His grandfather's warnings echoed in his mind. There are those who would try to stop you. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. He couldn't outrun them. He knew that. Whatever force had been tracking him, it wasn't something that could be outrun. It was bigger than him, and the only way to stop it was to face it. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice tight with urgency. "We have to stop the car." She turned to him, eyes wide. "What are you talking about? We can't just—" "We don't have a choice," he interrupted, his gaze never leaving the road. "I need to confront this." She didn't argue. She could see the determination in his eyes. She'd seen that look before, when he had faced his fear, when he had chosen to believe. And now, he was choosing to face whatever this was, head-on. Daniel slammed on the brakes, sending the car skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. The figure was closer now, almost upon them. He could see the shape of a person, a dark silhouette, too still in the moonlight. There was something unnerving about the way it moved, or didn't move. He took a deep breath. His heart was hammering in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He'd come this far. He couldn't let fear control him now. The figure stepped into the light, revealing its face. Daniel froze, a cold rush of disbelief sweeping over him. It was his grandfather. But this wasn't the same man he had seen in the park or the man from the sketches. This man's eyes were hollow, his expression empty, as though something had drained the life from him. He looked older, much older, and yet there was something distinctly unnatural about his presence. His grandfather's likeness stood before him, but it wasn't him. It couldn't be. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said, its voice warped, hollow, as though the words were being dragged from a deep, painful place. Daniel's breath hitched. What are you?" The figure's smile twisted into something grotesque. "I'm the force your grandfather warned you about. The thing that lives between the belief and the doubt. The thing that thrives when fear takes over." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. It wasn't his grandfather at all. It was something else. Something that had taken his shape, his voice. The power that his grandfather had warned him about. It was here, in front of him, wearing his grandfather's face. "This is what you've been running from, Daniel," the figure continued, stepping closer, its shadow growing longer, darker. "The power of belief isn't just a gift. It's a curse. A force that can be controlled, twisted, and bent to someone else's will." Daniel stepped back, his mind racing. "No. I won't let you control me. I won't let fear take me." The figure's grin widened, as if it found his defiance amusing. "You still don't understand, do you? Belief isn't a choice. It's a tool. And it's always been in my hands." Before Daniel could react, the figure lunged forward, its form blurring in the moonlight. In that instant, Daniel's heart stopped. The air thickened with an unseen pressure, pushing against him, suffocating him. It was as if the world itself was closing in on him, pressing him down, trying to force him into submission. his grandfather's voice rang in his mind. Fear only wins if you believe it can. Daniel's eyes widened. He understood. In that moment, he realized that the true battle wasn't just against the figure. It was against himself. The doubt that had plagued him, the fear that had always been there, was what had made this possible. He had been feeding it, feeding this force of darkness by allowing fear to control his every step. But he had changed. He had learned the power of belief. And he wasn't going to let it slip away now. Enough! Daniel shouted, his voice stronger than he'd ever heard it before. I choose to believe in myself. I choose to believe that I can control this. I am not afraid. The pressure around him lifted, the suffocating weight dissipating as if it had never been there. The figure faltered, its twisted grin faltering, its form flickering like a fading shadow. For the first time, it seemed uncertain. You think you can control me? The figure hissed, its voice crackling. You think your belief can stop me? Daniel stepped forward, his body shaking, but his resolve unbroken. I believe that my mind is stronger than fear, stronger than doubt. And no matter what you are, you cannot break that. The figure recoiled, its form flickering more violently now. This isn't over. You don't know what you're dealing with. I don't need to know, Daniel said, his voice steady. Because I know that I am the one in control. Not you. Not anyone. With that, he reached out, his hands steady, focusing every ounce of belief and strength into the moment. The figure screamed, a sound that tore through the night, but it wasn't enough. Slowly, like smoke dissipating in the wind, the figure crumbled, fading away into nothing. Daniel stood there, breathless, his body trembling from the intensity of what had just happened. For a moment, everything was still. The silence was almost too loud, too heavy, pressing in on him. He looked at his mother, who had watched the entire scene unfold in stunned silence. She looked just as shaken, but there was a glimmer of relief in her eyes. We did it, Daniel whispered, more to himself than to her. It's over. But just as he thought the tension had finally broken, something shifted. A distant sound, like the rustle of paper, echoed from behind them. Daniel turned, eyes wide. In the distance, a figure stepped out of the shadows. This one was different, cleaner, sharper. A man with a confident stride. Daniel's heart sank as recognition hit him. It was his grandfather, the real one. And this time, his eyes weren't hollow. They were full of purpose, full of something much darker. I told you, Daniel, his grandfather's voice echoed in the night. The battle is never over. And with that, Daniel realized the truth. The war for belief had only just begun. Daniel's heart raced, his entire body frozen in disbelief. His grandfather, the real one, stood before him, his presence undeniable, yet unmistakably different. The man who had once been a figure of wisdom, of love and guidance, now carried an aura of mystery and cold resolve. Daniel's mind reeled. How could this be? Wasn't he just? But no, the man in front of him was no ghost. He was solid, real. Grandpa. Daniel's voice cracked, a mixture of relief and fear. What's going on? Why are you? What happened? His grandfather's eyes softened for a moment, but the smile that formed on his lips wasn't one of affection. It was something far more cryptic. Daniel, his grandfather began, his voice steady, I knew this day would come. I hoped you would understand the power of belief, but not like this. Not through fear. Daniel felt a cold wave wash over him. Power of belief? What do you mean? You were the one who told me to trust in myself, to face my fears. His grandfather nodded slowly, almost as if pitying him. I did. But you were never supposed to use it this way. I thought you'd find your path without the darkness, without the struggle. Daniel shook his head, frustration rising within him. But you're telling me this wasn't real? That everything we've been through, every choice I've made, was all a mistake. No, his grandfather said, his tone firm now. I never said that. But you must understand. The power you've unlocked is immense. Too much for one person to wield without consequences. You've touched something that exists beyond our world. Something ancient. And now you are forever bound to it. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Bound? To what? He wanted to scream, to ask why his grandfather had left him in the dark for so long, why he had been allowed to fall into the trap of self-doubt only to be dragged into a battle of unimaginable weight. But before he could voice his anger, his grandfather continued. I've spent my life researching the boundaries of human potential, of belief. I knew the moment you were born, Daniel, that you were destined for something great. But you weren't meant to cross the threshold. You weren't meant to know the price of believing in something beyond yourself. What price? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His grandfather took a deep breath. The price is your very soul. Belief is not just a tool, Daniel. It's a force that shapes the very fabric of reality. Those who possess it can create or destroy, can move mountains or tear down worlds. But there is no balance in that. No harmony. Daniel felt his knees weaken, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. His soul? He had been so focused on finding answers, on proving himself, that he never once considered what it might cost him. What had he done by trusting in the power of belief? And what about you? Daniel asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and confusion. What have you done all these years? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you warn me? His grandfather's face hardened. Because I was afraid of what you would become. I saw the potential in you, Daniel, but I feared it would consume you. It consumed me. Daniel's chest tightened. You became this? He gestured to his grandfather's form, a twisted mirror of what he once was. You let it change you? I didn't let it, his grandfather snapped. It wasn't a choice. I thought I could control it. But I was wrong. The more I delved into the power, the more it took. And now, I am what I am. A prisoner to it. For the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel felt something close to pity for the man before him. This wasn't his grandfather. This was a version of him consumed by the very power he had tried to harness. This wasn't just about self-belief anymore. This was about balance, control, and what happens when one goes too far. Then what now? Daniel asked, looking between his grandfather and the empty road ahead. What am I supposed to do? If I've already crossed the threshold, if I've already made this choice, what's left? His grandfather sighed, the sorrow in his eyes clear. Now you must decide. There's still time for you to walk away, to let it go. You can return to a normal life. It won't be easy, but you can. But if you continue down this path, there's no turning back. The cost will only grow heavier. Daniel's mind raced. This was the moment he had feared. The moment he had been dreading all along. Could he walk away from the power that had awakened within him? Could he abandon everything he had fought for? But then something shifted. He remembered the words his grandfather had written in the letter, the last thing his grandfather had said to him before everything had gone dark. Self-belief is your key to unlocking the truth. Those words weren't just about power. They were about something more. About trusting in the strength to choose who he wanted to be, not who others expected him to be. Not even his grandfather. I can't turn my back on this, Daniel said, his voice resolute. Not now. I've seen too much. I've learned too much. I will control this power. I will use it to make a difference, to change the world for the better. I won't let it control me. His grandfather's eyes darkened, and for a brief moment, Daniel thought he saw something like fear in the old man's gaze. Then it's already too late. But as the words left his mouth, the world around them shifted, flickering like a broken light. The power of belief surged through Daniel's body, filling him with a raw, unstoppable energy. It coursed through his veins, buzzing in his ears, filling his mind with visions of a future that could be, one where he controlled his own destiny, one where he would rewrite the very rules of reality. "I am not afraid," Daniel said, his voice stronger now, a voice that resonated with the power he had unlocked. His grandfather took a step back, the shadow of his former self receding as the power began to slip from his grasp. In that instant, Daniel realized the truth. His grandfather hadn't just warned him about the power of belief. He had warned him about the danger of fear, the trap of letting doubt consume the mind. And for all his knowledge, his grandfather had been trapped by his own inability to overcome his fear. Daniel stood tall, feeling the surge of strength within him. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, he truly believed that he could face it. He could control the power, use it for good. And no matter what came next, he knew that the choice was his. With a final glance at his grandfather, the man who had once been a mentor, a guide, he turned and walked away. His future, his destiny, was in his hands now, and he wasn't going to let fear hold him back anymore. As he disappeared into the night, a final thought echoed in his mind. Belief is the power that shapes the world, but it's up to you to choose what it becomes.